Welcome to another episode of our Conversations on AI podcast. Today we've got Rob Garlick, who is an established professional and author of the book AI Abundance, Anarchy or Abundance, which touches on kind of how AI is impacting the future of work and things we can do to make sure that that is a pro-human future. So welcome to the podcast today, Rob. We're really happy to have you.
Thank you. Appreciate your time.
For the benefit of our listeners, do you want to give us a bit of an intro of who you are and kind of what the book is about, I think, starting on the motivations for writing it and then kind of what it covers?
Well, the brief background is I was lucky enough to spend 30 years in finance, really talking to investors, investing at the beginning in mainly areas of innovation. And a lot of those innovation areas, unfortunately, are disruptive. And so thinking through what that disruption looks like. And then in 2014, 2015, we started thinking about how innovation, particularly around technology, particularly around AI, would be disruptive for the world of work. And so that's an area I've been progressing. And it just changed so dramatically that I felt compelled to get some of these thoughts down in terms of a book. I also am a visiting professor of the Future of Work Center at Surrey University. So after 30 years of finance, I'm trying to make sure that we manage this next period of AI meets capitalism in a way that's going to be beneficiary for everybody. That's not going to be actually as easy as we think. In terms of, you just asked about kind of the motivations for the book. So sometimes you have these aha moments. I think most of us all had the aha moment when ChatGPT first launched, which was relatively obvious. But I also, when we were writing a report around robots, realized that there is so much innovation happening around the world of robotics. And so what you're going to have is we're going to go from non-human workers, which I would say is AI agents and robots, being less than 1% of the working population to more than 100% in the next couple of decades. Okay, so this is the biggest change in the history of work. But not only that, the economics of these new technologies are so transformative. I mean, some of these large language models do things that are 99% cheaper than the humans are able to do things at. And in some of the cases in the robots, we found that some of the robots are just so significant economically that you're basically going to get a lot of substitution. And so this brings up huge issues for companies, for societies, and obviously for people and economies in terms of what this means. And so my motivation for the book was to basically say, okay, we can see this coming, we can see what's about to happen, but how do we make sure we navigate it in a way that's going to bring enough people along with us? So there are 15 chapters in the book. The first 6 deal with the fact that this could be pretty bad. The number 6 chapter is about anarchy, but the other 9 chapters are around solutions. And what I really wanted to try and get to was, what are the solutions that we can try and think about to make sure we navigate this properly?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we'll get into some of those solutions as the conversation progresses. So you've obviously been in the profession for 30 years. Have you been thinking that you could write something that maybe has turned into a book around AI and technological impacts in that way? Or was it the ChatGPT aha moment where you were like, okay, no, something should be written here? Or have you kind of always had a propensity for things like this?
Look, so I started as an analyst back originally. I ended up running research for Citi for a number of years. I've been in the research department. So writing, was sort of a natural thing to do. And we were writing around these subjects since 2015, working in particular with a professor from Oxford, Carl Benedict Frey, who's one of the biggest sort of experts in the world on this topic. And we'd written a number of reports together. So we published a lot of this stuff anyway. And I felt that the book had to come about because I just don't think that people understand quite how dramatic this is going to be. And at the beginning of the book, I already said it, but at the beginning of the book that Queen Elizabeth II, when the financial crisis happened, she basically said to people, "Why did no one see this coming? We can see what's coming," and that sort of, but we need to do things about it quickly enough to make sure that we look after the people in this process. And there is a really big issue here, which is basically that the incentive structure for how we deal with this is not aligned. And that's potentially a big problem that we need to try and solve.
Mm-hmm.
So Rob, thanks for joining our podcast. And I read through your book over the past week in preparation. I was really thoroughly enjoying it, and it's kind of a two minds in that book. There's a sobering wake up call that the call to action that you're talking about, and then the set of solutions. One of the things that struck me was your call to action to leaderships, to leaders in the industry. Can you explain a little bit about what you mean by that, and how does that work for leaders? What's so important, and what do you think they can do?
So this is obviously very dramatic in terms of what's happening technologically, but we do have choices. It's not predetermined exactly what happens here. And the critical variable is leadership. They are the people that are investing in the technology. They're the people who are deciding in terms of how we navigate this path going forward. Now, leadership is a broad category, obviously, but in particular, I was trying to appeal to business leaders because there is a real tension between what potentially the technology can do and what their shareholder bases want, and also what the workers want. But it's also broader than that. Leadership is obviously what happens in society. Politicians, I sent the book to all 652 MPs in the UK, basically to say, you probably will need to understand some of these issues and what the solutions are. And so I'm appealing to leadership in terms of leaders of society. But there are also, every one of us has individual responsibility for self-leadership. And so, the book ends with talking around what is that responsibility that you have. Now, I'd say responsibility, it's also choice. Choice could be self-leadership in that I, decide what to buy. I decide who to work for. I decide who to vote for. And we all need to take a step up and think and make sure we understand the issues so that we can have that leadership to make sure that we manage and navigate this going forward. So that was sort of a part of what I was saying. And again, going back to the fundamental of this, yes, the technology can be amazing and it can be very progressive, but it's leadership's view of how we implement that and navigate that is going to determine the outcomes.
And you have a framework at the end of your book, the BEST framework. Do you mind explaining what that is? And
yeah. So, as I said, the first chapters are really a little bit difficult to read, I think, because they can be quite worrying about, cracks in wages and other things that are there. But the other 9 are around solutions, and I surfaced over 130 different solutions, deliberately trying to be very inclusive in the solutions. But I know that when you give a lot of options to people, they then say, well, okay, well, then narrow it down. What can we really do in that? Now, the further you narrow down, the more contentious things get, because there are trade-offs. These are not necessarily easy decisions about things, but I think we want to get to some broad agreement about what we want. And it starts with, in my view, most people agreeing that we want to make sure we are pro-human in how we use this technology. Now, I can explain that, and I can explain why that is a problem, okay? Because just saying we're pro-human is easy, but actually doing it is more difficult because there are these trade-offs, okay? So we can come back to that. But then when you say, okay, what does pro-human mean? What exactly that mean? Well, and I'm focused on the world of work here. But then it is, okay, well, can we, in the framework, agree that an outcome should be that we can get better jobs, okay, which is the B of the BEST framework. And again, I can talk about that. The reality is that we can, or the theory is that we can. The reality is that's not what's happened after 30 years of digitization, okay? So they'll get to the detail. But we should be able to agree that we should, in an AI world, be able to get to better jobs. The next one on that is, can we have enough jobs? There's no point in having a better job if you don't have a job. You need to have enough jobs. And we can debate if there's going to be enough jobs, but we can actually make solutions, and people are starting to talk about them now. For example, rather than half the people on the call not having a job and half the people having a job, we could decide that actually we want to move to 4-day weeks, 3-day weeks, 2-day weeks, and basically disperse jobs more. So it's possible to decide. That's just one example of that. For those people who unfortunately find themselves exited because of artificial intelligence, we do know, history has told us, that we need to put enough safety nets in place for people. And that comes in two forms, which is, one is that financial security, to be able to have, make sure that people can live. And there are different versions of that. The other one is actually kind of really important, which is the upskilling and reskilling of people, the skilling, because there will be jobs in the future. How do we make sure people can navigate from the old jobs to the new jobs that are there? But putting a support system in place, I think, is important. The next S is probably the most critical, but potentially the most difficult, which is you need to give people a say in this process. This can't be done from an autocratic perspective of one person decides that this is how the world is going to be run and everyone else especially has to fall in line. Okay, I don't think companies will find a challenge with that, because when you're implementing technology, you need to make sure that you're bringing people up along with you. Technology is often not the barrier, it's the people and the process when you're implementing technology. But it goes all the way to, okay, well, where really is the say going to come from? Because again, the incentives are misaligned on here. And the last thing on this that hopefully we can agree with, which is we might disagree about whether there's going to be joblessness or not, but we could agree that if the data comes through that there is a lot, for example, of joblessness, unemployment, that we have to tilt to change certain things. So, for example, if unemployment rises, income tax will likely go down. If income tax goes down, we need to find tax elsewhere. Where are we going to tilt? And so this idea of a tilt is that, a bit like interest rates are tilted in the economy, depending on economic data, that we agree to be data dependent, not ideological around this, that we can see that we might need to change some things depending on the data. So you put that together, and those 5 factors, what I'm trying to get to is to say to people, we can get to a better place, but can we all agree that being pro-human is a good thing? And can we all agree that having better jobs would be good, having enough jobs would be good, having safety nets would be good, having some say in the outcomes would be good, and having the tilts, if needed, would be good? And then after that, you obviously can get the devil in the detail and we can do horse trading, but at least we agree on something as a starting foundation to go with.
Yeah. Can I probe you on 2 of those things, and then I'll hand back to Stella? You talked about safety net and the fact that you talked about safety net. The question was, in the current economic and political climate, we are constantly under pressure, and especially in corporations where I work, money is very tight, and there's always a squeeze on wages. There's a squeeze on the amount of work. So we've had a lot of these dawns of technologies, and none of them have actually reduced the amount of work that we do. We do more work, yes, with new technologies. So how do we ensure that safety net exists when there's such a sort of like squeeze on our economic situations?
So the way you phrase the question, there was part of it in there, which, by the way, there are different paths that we can take, and the optimistic abundance path is that these new AI tools are, which they are, quite amazing, drive productivity, drive economic growth. Then we just basically have a redistribution to people in mass abundance. Okay, and again, we can talk about that. So there is a path with that, and what everyone, I think, what a lot of people would rightly argue is that history has shown that although technology does reduce some jobs, what actually it does is reduces prices that increase, and very often increases demand, and increases demand can increase the overall pie. Okay, so it can be very good for a lot of people. So that we don't need to necessarily worry. That's the thing. The problem with that this time, okay, that's what's happened in history, is that we are, I think, likely to get some very good economic growth, but I think it will come with jobs that go to non-human workers. Okay, we will substitute the human workers for AI and robotics and everything else that can do things a lot cheaper and increasingly a lot better. And so if you get the path, which is that we get growth without joblessness, then we probably need to put some security nets in place. Now, then you can debate about what those look like. I mean, the standard answer seems to be, well, let's go to universal basic income, UBI, and it's even be rebranded as UHI, universal high income, which is a nonsense. But anyway, that's sort of like, so but I don't think, back to one of the points you made, I'm not sure that we as societies at this point can necessarily afford UBI, but nor do I think we should necessarily go down that route, because actually a lot of people don't want to be put out on benefits and never work again. Work brings you a lot of areas. So what are the other things that we can do? Okay, so again, going down into the detail of these things, you get into sort of like, debates around what that could look like. The other thing you mentioned, though, in terms of, I mentioned about skilling, is that I think most companies would see that there's an opportunity to give people the skilling to be able to use these AI tools to do these things right now. That's good. But also, to where are we going to skill people to make sure that they're looked after as companies are thinking about their growth opportunities for the future? But that's not what's happened. The last 2 decades, we've seen learning and development fall substantially. So we're all talking from the UK. Learning and development, when I last looked, was down in real terms over 28% in the UK. So what's happened is that safety net hasn't been put in place. And I could make an argument to you that the biggest skilling opportunity going forward is going to be for the non-humans rather than for the humans. Mm. So again, we get into sort of devil in the detail on this stuff, which again, we can drill into.
Yeah. The other one thing I wanted to probe you on was about having a say. So again, maybe I'm looking at this from a technological perspective. When Excel came out, or another tool, Power Automate, we were told this is democratizing automation in the workforce. So basically, these robotic agents that humans were implementing were supposed to free us up of mundane day-to-day tasks. But they didn't. They actually created more complexity and chaos within corporations. A lot of companies don't know how many Excel files are sitting around. They don't know how many Power automations are going on. And with agents coming in, and this is something I struggle with in my workplace, is that I'm trying to govern on a set of these agents to make sure that there is transparency about what these things are and what they're doing in a corporation, so that we don't increase complexity, because the more complex a company is, the harder it is for people to do their job. So there's less efficiencies, and people are doing enormous amount of work to understand what is going on. So having a say, which technology says you're going to have a say in how your company is run, is anathema to what is actually happening, and I see that with AI agents as well. How do you see that in the terms that you use? You might have not used the word having a say in the same sort of vein that I'm using it, but that's how I'm seeing the world from my perspective.
And look, you've got decades of experience of implementing a number of these things, and you can see that complexity, and so. You trying to make sure that you can navigate as other people who are kind of, implementing technology, making sure that they can say to the bosses, look, it's actually a little bit more complicated than this. People want, what happened with the ChatGPT moment, which is one of the reasons why it's different, is that almost every C-suite and every board basically said, we need to do stuff around AI, deliver something for me. And so then it cascades down quite quickly, okay, a lot quicker than normal technological change does. But as you point out, actually it can create quite a complexity, and the complexity can be, okay, what about governance? What about the regulations that are coming? What about how we train people? There's lots of complexity here. So there's this sort of challenge between going really quickly on the one hand, move fast and break things, versus making sure that we're doing things in a responsible way. Now, what I meant more with say was that as part of that process that you said, is that if it frees you up from doing 20% of your mundane task, which is very, very possible, that could be a great opportunity for you to have a little bit more time to be able to do more things that are interesting and value added and everything else. But what actually happens in businesses, more or less, is that if we've just had 20% of our time reduced, then 1 in 5 of us gets fired and the other 4 have to do the work. Okay, that's it. And that process carries on iterating, unfortunately. And AI could really speed that up. And so if people fear that, which they do, by the way, 31% of people in financial services and 32%, I think it is, in technology, think they will be out of a job in 5 years' time. Okay, so that's according to the recent Gallup data. So if people feel that, then they're probably not going to be implementing the technology in the same way. So we need to make sure that we're helping bring people along, because they're part of the solution to make sure we get this technology implemented to help our customers and help the firms and everything else. So this is a sort of, it should be a symbiotic relationship, I think. And one of the things, the reason why I use the word say, I did a number of years ago, I did a master's in behavioral change. And one of the things you learn, it's sort of like 101 in behavioral change, is that giving people agency to be part of that process is a really important factor. And if you want to then take that into what's about to happen, we need to, within society, also give people agency to decide what is the type of society and the type of companies that we want to run for this, because otherwise we're going to find ourselves overwhelmed by non-human workers and potentially a path that society looks back on and says, that's not quite what we want. So let's look forward to saying what we want.
It's sparked a few follow-ups that I'll get to after this section, because I think it would be helpful for our listeners to kind of anchor. You've mentioned a lot, Rob, about the navigating this path towards a pro-human future of work and how your book and the Best Framework can kind of orchestrate that. But it would be interesting to discuss what that path actually is and kind of how it might look. And I think some recent research from Anthropic gives us a bit of a understanding of how they see AI impacting the labour market specifically. So I'm going to pose two of their findings to you, and would be interesting to get your insights on how you kind of see that being managed with the Best Framework. So the first one is they found variability in how AI is going to impact the labour market, particularly that it's going to be first impacting older, female, more educated and higher paid roles. So across those four variable conditions, how do you think we manage that in an equitable way?
By the way, I'm really, I think that a lot of the stuff that Anthropic is putting out is excellent. I'm really pleased they're sort of embracing, you know, and giving people data and giving people thoughts around this. I think it's very helpful to, again, have a say that's collective rather than, you know, and raise the issues. Just breaking down some of the things you just asked for there. Look, you mentioned educated and high paid. We are about to go through a cognitive industrial revolution. We can learn stuff from other industrial revolutions where blue collar work was impacted. In this case, of course, the educated will be significantly impacted, because this is a cognitive industrial revolution where these large language models have gone past what most of us could do. They're kind of PhD level plus, and they will absolutely surpass us in a number of different areas. There'll still be bottlenecks that humans will be great at and competitive advantage, but that is the educated side of it is something to ponder, because we have a whole education system that does cognitive credentialing, say, for example, of our children through GCSE and A-levels, wherever it may be when you're around the world, that large language models can basically do like that. Okay, so we have to kind of like assess what that means. Your point on well paid, well, a lot of people moved into those white collar, you know, positions, knowledge economy positions, because they were better paid. But that makes them more vulnerable. And again, going back to the aha moments, I was lucky enough to do a call a couple of years ago with Marshall Goldsmith, who's the top executive coach in the world. And he had just had an AI bot that had been delivered for him based on all of his content. And he said to me at the time, he said, you have to realize that essentially this takes a portion of intelligence down to zero. Okay, his bot is available for free 24/7, which is the same way that, you know, the large language. So we are potentially the high paid roles that can be substituted with technology potentially have a very severe drop in the pricing that they have and the wages that they can command. The female one that you mentioned there is very interesting, because in some ways there are some studies that show that a number of different roles, because this won't happen to everything all at the same time, but a number of different roles that females are over-index in are more vulnerable. But at the same time, there are potentially the biggest growth area for new jobs in the future is going to be in the caring economy. And it tends to be that females do over-index in the caring economy already. And so there's a whole different portion of what that looks like. But so they are both affected and not. And then you also mentioned the older demographic as well. The older demographic actually is probably the better placed for now, because they are the ones that are having to make sure they manage the complexity that Armin just talked about using their vast experience. They are the ones that are the masters, the human in the loop, the human on the loop. They are the ones that are helping train things going forward. So I think for now, actually, the older population are absolutely necessary to make sure that their experience and wisdom guides this process, but also trains the machines.
Mm. So do you think then if this research and the predictions that they've devised kind of comes true, do you think that there needs to be variable safety mechanisms in place to kind of capture the impact of AI impacting this labour market across these different groups differently?
Well, we haven't spoken about it, but the one that I think does need to be different is what's happening on youth unemployment and the graduates, because they're the people that are most exposed. And so we really need solutions right now, not in 5 years time, but we really need solutions now to basically say, how are we going to help this cohort of amazing young talent get on the first rungs of the career ladder? So that's an example of doing something differently. I don't know that it's necessarily easy as a society to pick out certain other demographics and say what's going to happen. But also, I'm not sure that you necessarily need to at this point, because most people think of this as a white collar knowledge work issue, but this is far bigger than that. This is going to impact, because of of robotics, which is coming after it. It'll take a little time, but this is going to impact white collar work and blue collar work. That is one of the reasons why it's different this time. And so we need to prepare safety nets for a lot of parts of the economy. When we did one study in one previous paper, basically 2/3 of jobs are susceptible to these trends. So it's pretty widespread.
Mm. Well, you've kind of touched on the second finding from the Anthropic study we wanted to talk to you about, and that's the spread of unemployment isn't across enterprise, but there's been a trend since 2022 of reducing employment of entry-level positions, or that the employment of entry-level positions is slowing down. So yeah, do you want to just touch on that and kind of discuss whether that's in the best interests of a company, and then I guess society more broadly?
So when you start talking about youth unemployment, for example, people kind of point to lots of different pressure points that are there. I mean, macro geopolitics, warfare, all these sort of things. Where we are today is that 1 in 4 young people is 16 to 24 years old, around the world are not in education, employment, or training. Okay, so we start there. Now in the UK, it's 16% are NEET. But whichever of those numbers you take, they're really terrible already. Okay, and we have a problem already. Now, part of that problem is we have an oversupply of graduates that have been coming out. The sort of the line that everyone was given is, kind of go to grad school and train yourself and things will be good. And as Banksy once said, unfortunately, that path is not as open to people as it was much before. But we're only at the start of this AI revolution. And the beginning part of that process is the areas that are easiest to automate are really the starter roles for AI interns, but also the starter roles for human interns. And so you will, across lots of different domains, if there was one particular domain, then it would be easier to navigate. But across lots of different domains, they are going to be reducing the number of graduates that they hire. Now, is that finance, is that law, is that technology, is that customer service? You can go on, is that consultancy? The answer is yes. And so if you look at the UK, just as an example, we now have less, according to one website, we now have less than 10,000 graduate jobs being advertised. We graduate over 1 million graduates a year in the UK. Okay, so what happens there is that because the number of jobs that are available gets limited, you've got this more of a bigger buildup of people that are looking for jobs. And that is, you can see that in the competitive nature that people now have. There are, hundreds and hundreds of people that are applying. And unfortunately, that creates big issues, because then people start feeling like, well, hang on a minute, I've done everything I should do, and now I can't get a job. Is that because of me? And it's creating this potentially big problem in society that we need to deal with. And so we need to come up with solutions. And I'm not pretending they're easy, but in your question, you did say, what about companies of the future? We need to be thinking around what's called a path to mastery. We need, as I talked about, those experts that are the humans on the loop or in the loop to be navigating these systems in the right way. But you need to be able to train people to go through that. And how does that path look like if we taken away some of the people at the bottom of the ladder? And that's not an easy thing to work through, but we do need to make sure we kind of try and think it through best we can. And in a hurry, because this is an issue that's already happening, that's potentially going to get even worse, and then we'll have to overcorrect.
Do you think there's any aspect of it that's short-sighted? Because, to your point of having the role of experts, if we are kind of accepting the fact that we don't need the next generation of human workers, does it come to a point where we then don't actually have people with the right level of knowledge to be able to offer human level expertise in something?
Possibly, but that could be a long time down the road. So one of the reasons why this bottleneck is happening is because when there's uncertainty about the future, one of the things that companies do first is they reduce the number of new roles rather than getting rid of people in the existing roles. Okay. And the new roles include the funnel of new graduates that are coming through. Okay. So it's just part of a sort of, normally that's a cyclical cycle. In downturns, I'm basically going to restrict the number of people I hire, and in upturns, I'll hire them again. The reason why this might be different is because this is a structural change to technological capability that's going to carry on getting better and better. Okay. But back to what I said is, so you can understand why people are using the same playbook they've historically used. Is it different? Is it different this time? Well, one of the reasons why it might be different this time is because actually I don't necessarily need as many people going through the funnel. I need a few that I train really, really well to become those experts. And how do we train them differently to be able to do that? But in addition, if I'm going to have lots of people in the future that want these jobs, then I basically will be able to then, buy somebody in rather than having to train them up. So you can make an argument that, longer term argument that maybe people are making rational decisions for themselves in terms of their companies, believing they're going to have the capability to basically get people rather than having to take a very long-term view. The problem with that, obviously, is society, might backlash against that.
I have one more question, and then I'm going to hand it over to you, Armin, to talk about how profit incentives kind of fit into this. But you touched earlier on your background in business change and kind of how that influences your observation that there's a contradiction that exists within companies of you have to bring people along the journey if you're encouraging them to use AI, but there's a kind of psychological unsafety that they feel because they fear that the AI is going to replace their job. How I have a background in business change myself, so I can foresee that that's very difficult to kind of bring people along a journey when the realistic view is actually that this job is like the AI is likely to automate a large part, if not all, of positions as you've been touching on. So how do you kind of marry that like inherent contradiction?
Well, look, it's not easy. Is probably the first thing to say, but the second thing is, business transformations have been happening for years, and sort of we can learn from the successes and failures of those. And, you'll know that the majority, sort of, 3/4 of business transformations don't meet their end goals because not of the technology, but because of the people and process. So it's in the company's interest to make sure that they are, bringing people along with them to help the implementation of the tools that they've got. So I think there's a sort of, again, going back, I said it earlier, a bit of a symbiotic relationship. I think this very often starts with a simple thing, which is include people, ask them, how are we going to do it? And if this is a change one other thing, the communication stuff is really important, but it's a two-way communication. It's not this is what you must do it. It's this is what we're doing, and this is the reasons why, and let's have a conversation about it. And that conversation could surface well, isn't this going to replace me? Now, then it gets into a slightly different thing, which is, okay, well, companies will very often say, well, we're going to look after you. Now, then it becomes, do actions speak louder than words? So just as an example, it used to vex me enormously that in my old role, in my old company, we used to sometimes reduce the headcount on equity salespeople and then go and hire them on equity derivative salespeople. Now, there's not a lot of difference, but can you train people to cross that Rubicon? The answer is yes, but you need to do it. You need to do it early enough. And so can you have a conversation that says, we're going to look after you as best we can, including mobility opportunities, new opportunities in reskilling, etc. And so you demonstrate culturally by your actions, not just your words, that this is the positive intent. And then by that, you get more people buying into the journey because they feel they're going to be part of it. Firstly, they're asked, and secondly, you know, that they can see that actually this is a company that supports them. And so, you know, the self-interest here is that there is a very wide difference between the winners and losers of implementation of technology. And if I just give you an example, I think this is really stark. Unfortunately, only 20% of people at work are positively engaged at work, according to Gallup's survey. Only 22% of managers are positively engaged at work. I mean, that is a shocking statistic. But in the best performing companies, 79% of managers are positively engaged at work. Guess which ones are going to be able to motivate and drive transformation quicker? And so we need to be thinking a little further down the sort of the value stack to say, how do we make sure that people are taken along this path and engaged and are willing to make sure that we as a company are going to transform quickly and everyone's going to be winning rather than just a few and most people are out the door.
Yeah.
Probably, Stella, but I hope that gave you some.
No, it's good. It's interesting. I think I just start thinking about like the things you've touched on, but the broader safety systems that are going to need to be in place to kind of pick up maybe some of those pieces of when individuals are losing jobs to AI.
Yeah, I think what you just said really resonates with me because I used to work as a software developer in .coms, and it was very exciting back in the late 90s, very exciting, fast-paced, a lot of agency in what you were doing. And then the .com crash happened, then I joined a corporation, and one of the first things my boss asked me was, how long will you think that this project will take? I said, it will take me a week. And he said, I want you to do that in 2 months. And I said, why? I said, we don't do things fast here. We do things in a measured way. So that was a culture shock to me. But, and you know, I just want to take you back to the pro-human aspect that you were talking about and the profit motive. So I've worked in many organizations and you know, there's always talk about being pro-employee and so on. But it always boils down to the stock price and the markets and how they see it. And the redundancies that you were talking about are cyclical, where, you know, they go back to the city and look how well we're doing. We got rid of 20% of our workforce, and then the cycle happens again. How do you see that cycle, kind of dichotomy between the profit motive of the CEOs, that they have to abide by what the markets want, and being pro-human? Because to me, the way that you described it, pro-human means you have to take a cut towards your profits. You have to invest in skilling. You have to invest in emotional intelligence rather than brutal kind of financial management. Or am I mischaracterizing what you were saying earlier?
Well, no, you're not. You know, again, there's nuance. I just mentioned positive engagement for managers and best performing companies is, you know, significantly better. So there are reasons, obviously, to bring people along with you. And the truth is, in terms of pro-human, that we do know how to do this. We do know how to grow people and help them with adaptability, stability, and a whole bunch of other factors that I put in the back of the book in this chapter. But what you've surfaced there, Armin, is probably the thing in the book that vexed me most. And I say it vexed me most in terms of these incentives from someone who has sat at the seat of the right of the front row of capitalism, raising capital for lots of companies and lots of CEOs for multiple years, and understanding the investors, but also having run teams, understanding the teams, and that real tension that's there. And when you think about what's about to happen, we have very progressive technology that will make decision-making more pro-machines. And we have an economic system and a way that companies are set up that is basically done for profitability. And so when it comes to being pro-human, almost all people are going to say they are, but the incentive system is not based that way. And one of the greatest investors of all time, Charlie Munger, the partner of Warren Buffett for many years, basically said, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome. So what happened, without going too much into history, but what happened in 1970 in the third iteration of capitalism, because capitalism does change, was that shareholder primacy, essentially profit maximization, became the be all and the end all. And from a CEO perspective in the States, you went from 20-1 average CEO pay to worker to now 400-1. And so they've incentivized the CEOs to be very pro profitability. And so what you have is an economic system and corporates, which are what's called plutonomies, run for shareholders, is that you have a system that's set up to not be pro-human, unless the humans are all leaving and so then you kind of try and say, and I try and say this in the book, okay, well, if we know that's what the problem is, that we have an incentive system that is not designed to do that, how will it change? And I kind of work through, well, all the different stakeholders. Are governments going to change the system? And the answer is yes, with a lag if unemployment gets very high, but they're running with pro-innovation at the moment. Are consumers going to do it? Are the media going to help? Are boards going to help? I kind of go through all these different areas. And actually, I think that the one that has the least amount of power today has the most amount of incentive to be pro-human is the workers. And that, unfortunately, if you don't look after people well enough, you will have forms of backlash. And we're already starting to see this in multiple different ways. And just as an example, Hollywood in 2023, in terms of pushing back in terms of what artificial intelligence could do for creative areas, sort of is reminiscent in a way of a kind of what the Luddites were trying to do in 1811. The U.S. longshoremen, which are basically the port authorities in the States, in 2024, they got a pay rise for the dock workers, the longshoremen, of 62%. So they're just examples of sort of forms of backlash, and it will take different varieties. And so the problem is if the shareholder primacy bit pushes too much, because this is the biggest investment trade in history. Labor is more than 50% of GDP. It's the biggest cost of good line companies. If you substitute people and increase profit margins and increase return for investors too much, then you are going to have forms of backlash. That's basically what the history has said, and you can feel that's building up. And so what my book is trying to basically say is, let's not go there, because that's not really a good thing. Let's try and build bridges to make sure that as best as possible we come to some more shared alignments rather than misalignments. And I'm not pretending that's easy. I'm just saying that we know that we need to do it. So let's think through how we're going to try and get there.
But are you advocating a realignment in capitalism then? For that to happen, the markets cannot be the primary force.
So enlightened leaders might want to do it, but if they don't perform, they might find themselves out of a job. So it might be that we need a sort of adjusting capitalism, and how would that change? One is that capitalism is very dynamic, and basically as tensions rise, we find a way of coming to the right equilibrium that's in everyone's best interests. Okay, that's the good way. It could be a happy version, and by the way, the abundance version could be happy for people as well. So it's not that this is all negative. And by the way, I do believe we're going to get into a good place. My fear is that we'll get into a bad place before we get into a good place. So it could work out, but unfortunately, I think the history of what has happened since Milton Friedman, since 1970, is that we have been building up a vast inequality and a distrust in society and political polarization and all these different things, which AI layers onto and exacerbates and accelerates. And that I don't think, for example, the shareholders as a body are going to basically say we're going to be benevolent to making sure we're being very pure human, looking after all the humans in the process, when this is the biggest opportunity to accelerate returns and margins for themselves. So it might cause a break and a warning, but also a warning I hope we avoid, which is if it breaks, capitalism breaks because people are really frustrated and we've got too much joblessness, etc. Then I think that the power nature, the incentive nature will change. And so what it could change to, and I'm not saying we're going to go there, but just a warning, is that we've seen this in other countries, and you got basically that you moved to co-determination in companies. The employees have bigger representation on boards because they decide what the CEO is doing, not just the shareholders. So that's to be avoided, because we'll get there via breakages. Let's find paths through that are mutually beneficial for everybody. And that's what my book is trying to surface. But I'm not pretending it's going to be easy.
Yeah, absolutely. It is worrying in a sense. But let's go to a dark place before we end up in a much more happy place. So you talked about these sort of like social dissonance and revolts. How do we stop a slide into anarchy? How do we make sure that what I got from what you were saying is that things will have to get bad before they get better? And for them to get bad, I can see, through populism, through the politics that we're going through and the economics that we're going through, that there's going to be a lot of pain. And that pain will come out as social revolt, I would imagine. Is it the government's role to manage that revolt, to create kind of legislation or regulation? How do you see that being managed in a controlled way?
So I think it needs a responsibility of all of us to understand what the issues are and understand, to try and envisage what good would look like and try and move towards that. And that's really what the book's about. Okay, so just understanding these things and then having a conversation around them. What we have at the moment is, unfortunately, we have a few decision makers who are making decisions that are going to affect people very substantially down the path. And because, again, they don't have agency in that, if you don't include people in that and they feel left out of it and put upon and everything else, that's probably not a good thing. So I'm trying to advocate for greater conversation. Now, you said, what about politicians? I mean, obviously, we have representatives. Now, the answer is, and I said to you, I sent it to all 652, whatever there are of MPs as an example, to basically say. So I think that they absolutely need to be on top of this right now. And the tinderbox bit might be, back to Stella's question, it might be over graduates. And let's surface that. It's the history, unfortunately, of dealing with these significant issues that are not easy: climate change, energy independence, tobacco, social media. We've known these issues for quite some time, but we very often only get to the solution when something breaks. It's sort of like, going firefighting. So how do we get ahead of that? How do we have enough conversation? Now, I thought, Armin, you're about to ask, when you said let's get into a dark place, I thought you're about to ask what is in the chapter prior to the anarchy chapter, which is an absolute collapse in wages. I mean, it is very possible you go through this thing called economic singularity, which all sounds very scary, and we don't know what it looks like the other side. But the way you get there is essentially these mean, these large language models can do things at 99% cheaper than humans. Humanoid robots already today I can buy one from China that gives me a 10-week payback period. 10 weeks. I mean, it just completely alters the economics. And the problem with altering the economics and substituting people for that technology is that if you then have massive amounts of joblessness and wage declines, you have no consumption, you have no income tax, you have no, what does asset value do? And so these are not mad scenarios. They are potentially plausible enough to make sure we don't go down that route and we alter course, because this is not, again, predetermined. So the simple answer, so it could get really bad, back to your, go to a dark place. The answer to your question is, let's educate ourselves about the issues, understand that they are difficult trade-offs, but have the conversation that's a collective conversation. And one of the best ways of doing it is say, where do we want to go to? What does good look like? And that, again, I'm not pretending it's perfect, but that comes back to the best framework, gives us a framework for at least having that discussion.
I was just thinking when you were saying that section at the end there, Rob, which is so interesting, because I often think of like, what do we do if we have no consumption? It kind of completely breaks everything. But there was a study, and I'm going to say it now so I remind myself to put it in the commentary of the podcast, because I can't remember what it was called, but MIT ran a simulation study where they kind of forecasted that exact scenario and showed the economic impacts of what it means for the equilibrium if you have no demand for anything. So I'm going to add that into the notes of the podcast. But to end then, I guess, what is something, you've kind of touched on it, but what's something that you hope readers take away from your book?
So I try to surface solutions, okay? I don't want to be a doomsayer and say it's all bad and we're in, because I actually believe that we're going to get to a good place in the end. I just fear that we could go down before we go up, and I'm trying to help build the bridges. There are lots of solutions, which means there are lots of choices, which means that we need to educate ourselves on the choices and be able to understand what we want good to look like and how we want to get there. And so right towards the beginning of this conversation, I said, this is about leadership, and it is about leadership. And the incentive thing is but it's also about self-leadership. And we all need to take responsibility of that. And if we do have the agency to say to get there, then I am sure we can paint. I can paint you. We haven't talked about it too much actually, but I can paint you some pretty good scenarios of what AI will lead us. And so let's envisage that, work backward, what we want, work backwards about the choices we need to make now, the decisions we need to make now that help us get there collectively, for the many, not just the few. Yeah.
Maybe we could end on a positive scenario. Maybe we could discuss one before we go. What's one positive scenario you've envisioned, Rob, for the pro-human future of work?
Well, I mean, look, I'll use the first couple of bits of the best scenario. So, can we get better jobs? Absolutely. I mentioned that the Gallup data of 20% positively engaged. We know what creating good jobs can look like for growth of people as well as profitability. We know that AI agents, I mean, it's not difficult to work out that AI agents could really, you could have one that's a coach, one that does your T&E, one that does your research for you, one that's doing your communication and emails. Anyway, you can have all these different agents that are going to be doing this. What that could do is it could free up your time, freeing up your time from the mundane tasks that you don't like to do the stuff that's really good for you. And that comes a bit back to the enough jobs. It is very possible, I think probable, that we are going to end up in a place where actually people will be working less, 4-day weeks, 3-day weeks, etc. The weekend was only born 100 years ago, okay, out of the Industrial Revolution. People used to work in agrarian economies like 7 days a week or 6 days a week. And so I think that we will have more leisure time. And I did say at the beginning that you potentially get more growth. So with the more growth, it's a question about the redistribution of that growth in terms of helping people navigate this. And I think that having jobs is good. So let's not go put everyone on benefits. That's not what we're after here. But the answer is we can. So, we can get better jobs, enough jobs, more leisure time. And I believe we will.
I thoroughly enjoyed our session. I have one last question for you, a personal selfish question. So I was looking at your website, and you do all kinds of consultancy and services and so on, and leadership development. What's one thing you could tell me that would make me a more pro-human, now that we've known each other for the past hour?
We do not know all the answers to where we're going. But if we start with the basic tenet that what we want is to make sure that we're pro-human, and we ask ourselves in each interaction, are we helping in being pro-human enough? Are we helping other people through? Then we'll get into a good place. We just need to keep surfacing that question. As I said, the direction of travel might be pro-machine and pro-profitability currently, but we can and we will get through that. And I'll leave you with the front cover of the book has a Einstein-inspired image with a hand pointing out like Uncle Sam in terms of, pointing to you. The reason why that's there, just to finish on the positive note, is because Einstein, when he was 26 years old, gave birth to the most famous equation in history, which then gave birth to nuclear technology, which then gave birth to the technology that can power us or can exterminate us. And just before his death, age 76, his last public act, he basically said to humanity in the Bertrand Russell Einstein Manifesto, remember your humanity and forget the rest. And AI is somewhat similar. It can power us, or it could destroy potentially humanity. And I think we'll come to the same conclusion, which is remember your humanity and forget the rest. And so my challenge back to you would be, you said one thing, but each of us think, what's one thing we can do to make sure that we're being pro-human in our actions, to take that responsibility forward? And if we all do that, we'll be in a good place.
Thank you, Rob. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
Anything else?
For those listening, I think you can get and read into Rob's book. It's on your website. It's available there, isn't it? I don't know, where else can people go and have a look for it?
On Amazon. I was pleased we managed to get #1 on AI, #1 on business and leadership, #1 on everything else. So yeah, it's good. It's but yeah, please crack away. Enjoy.
Well, thank you so much, Rob. It's been brilliant having you on. Really appreciate it.